to our YouTube channel. My name is Mesu
And I'm April.
And today we're going to discuss about
Humanistic Psychotherapy. So guys, we're going to discuss about the goals, the elements, and the concepts. So, let's get started!
Humanistic psychology is a perspective that emphasizes looking at the whole individual and stresses concepts such as free will, self-efficacy, and self-actualization. Rather than concentrating on dysfunction, humanistic psychology strives to help people fulfill their potential and maximize their well-being. But before we dig deeper into that, let's discuss about its brief history. The early development of humanistic psychology was heavily influenced by the works of a few key theorists, especially Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers. Other prominent humanist thinkers include Rollo May and Erich Fromm. Carl Rogers is widely regarded as one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. He was a humanist thinker and believed that people are fundamentally good. Rogers also suggested that people have an actualizing tendency, or a desire to fulfill their potential and become the best people that they can be.
Goal of humanistic psychotherapy. So what is the goal of humanistic psychotherapy? Well, basically, the primary goal of humanistic psychotherapy is to foster self-actualization. But what is self-actualization? In humanistic psychotherapy, self-actualization means the inborn tendency to grow in a healthy way. And humanists believe that psychological problems like depression, anxiety, personality disorders, eating disorders, and most other forms of psychopathology are the byproducts of making growth process difficult. People who seek the professional help for psychological problems has something within them, the capacity and the will to grow toward help. But somehow their growth has been interrupted and distorted. So the task of the humanistic therapist is, through the therapeutic relationship, to create a climate in which clients can resume their natural growth toward psychological wellness. And if we are all guided by the self-actualization tendency from the beginning of our lives, how could we find ourselves being depressed, anxious, or struggling with psychological issue? It lies in the fact that the need for positive regard can, at times, override the natural tendency to self-actualize. And that is when we face or choose between receiving positive regard from the important people in our lives and following our own natural inclinations, then we may choose the positive regard. But the problems may arise when the positive regard is conditional rather than unconditional. So, conditional positive regard means that we are valued only if we met certain conditions. If you consider to your own family or even those of your childhood friends, you can probably identify some of the conditions of worth that parents place on their children. For example, they only love you only if you will get a good grade, or only if you dress how they like, only if you will adopt their values, or even only if you will excel in academics or sports, and so on. Usually, kids can quickly sense the conditions that their parents place on their acceptance. And because they need their parents' acceptance, they do their best to meet these conditions. In the process, however, some kids will off the right path of their own self-actualization tendency, and which may have guided them into their another direction. And by so doing, when they compare the selves which they are, or the real self, with the selves they could be if they fulfill their own potential, which is the ideal self, they will perceive a difference or discrepancy. Humanists use the term incongruence to describe this discrepancy. and they view it as the root of psychopathology. In contrast to this is the congruence, which means a match between the real self and the ideal self. And it is achieved when self-actualization is allowed to guide a person's life without the involvement of any conditions of worth. And as a result, mental health is optimized. That is, congruence happens when a person experiences unconditional positive regard from others. No, only if conditions are placed them for acceptance, so they are free to develop and grow according to their own self-actualization's tendency. And also, it is important to know that all the conditions of worth originally come from others. They can eventually become incorporated into our own views of ourselves. That is, conditional positive regard from others brings forth conditional positive self-regard, whereas unconditional positive regard from others brings forth unconditional positive self-regard. The people that surround us, which are the important persons in our lives, communicate to us what is acceptable or praiseworthy about ourselves. And the whole self or even only certain aspect. And at some later time, we adapt those views in our evaluations of ourselves. Example, considering a child grew up with very strict parents who set a very high expectation from him. So basically, the child feels pressured by his parents, where he reached the point of his life focusing on the ideal self rather than the real self. So again, what is the difference between the real self and the ideal self? Again, the real self is when the child has his own freedom in doing what makes him happy, and the ideal self is what his parents want him to be. So this is when incongruence occur. Rather than focusing on what he wants, the child eventually felt pressured and compelled to follow what his parents want him to become, far from reaching congruence, which is what he really wants to achieve, free from judgment and unconditional positive regard. So his parents is lack of unconditional positive regard as they focus on the conditional positive regard. Their love is a precondition to what the child can offer rather than what the child already has. And that's the goal of humanistic psychotherapy. Now, let's take a look at the elements of humanistic psychotherapy.
The elements of humanistic psychotherapy. Because self-actualization is a primary and natural tendency in all people, the therapists need only to make the conditions right for it to occur. The therapist does not directly heal the clients per se. Instead, the therapist fosters the client's self-healing tendencies toward growth. The therapist accomplishes this by creating therapist-client relationship characterized by three therapeutic conditions, which we will be discussing in a few. Much like psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud, Rogers believed that the therapeutic relationship could lead to insights and lasting changes in clients. While Freud focuses on offering interpretations of what he believed were the unconscious conflicts that led to clients' troubles, Rogers believed that the therapist should remain non-directive. That is to say, that the therapist should not direct the client, should not pass judgment on the client's feelings, and should not offer suggestions or solution. Instead, the client should be an equal partner in the therapeutic process. How does it work? Mental health professionals who utilizes this approach strive to create a therapeutic environment that is conformable, non-judgmental, and empathic. Two of the key elements of client-centered therapy are the following. First is non-directive. Therapist allows clients to lead the discussion and do not try to steer the client in a particular direction. Second, It emphasizes unconditional positive regard, which was discussed earlier in this video. The therapist shows complete acceptance and support for the clients without casting judgment. According to Carl Rogers, a client-centered therapist needs three key qualities for it to be successful. First, genuineness. The therapist needs to share his or her feelings honestly. By modeling this behavior, the therapist can help teach the client to also develop this important skill. Second, unconditional positive regard. The therapist must accept the client for who they are and display support and care no matter what the client is facing or experiencing. Rogers believed that people often develop problems because they are accustomed to only receiving conditional support, acceptance that is only offered if the person conforms to certain expectations. By creating a climate of unconditional positive regard, the client feels able to express his or her true emotions without fear of rejections. As Rogers explained, unconditional positive regard means that when the therapist is experiencing a positive, acceptant attitude toward whatever the client is that moment, therapeutic movement or change is more likely. It involves that the therapist's willingness for the client to be whatever the feeling is going. On that moment, confusion, resentment, fear, anger, courage, love, or pride. The therapist prizes the client in a total rather than a conditional way. Third, empathic understanding or empathy. The therapist needs to be reflective, acting as a mirror of the client's feelings and thoughts. The goal of this is to allow the client to gain a clear understanding of their own inner thoughts, perceptions, and emotions. By exhibiting these three characteristics, the therapist can help clients grow psychologically, become more self-aware, and change their behavior and self-direction. In this type of environment, a client feels safe and free from judgment. Rogers believed that this type of atmosphere allows clients to develop a healthier view of the world and a less distorted view of themselves. How effective is it? Several large-scale studies have shown that three qualities that Rogers emphasized, genuineness, unconditional positive regard, and empathic understanding, are all beneficial. However, some studies have suggested that these factors alone are not necessarily enough to promote lasting change in clients. One evaluation that looked at the effectiveness of person-centered therapy suggested that this approach was effective for individuals experiencing common mental health problems such as depression and anxiety, and may even be helpful to those experiencing more to moderate severe symptoms.
The humanistic concepts. In humanistic concepts, it believes that human is like plants. People have an inborn tendency to grow and that certain conditions foster their growth. Humanists call this tendency self-actualization and presume that if the person's environment fosters it, self-actualizations proceed without interference. Humanists also recognize that people need certain things to live, and just as plants need sunlight, people need positive regard. Well, positive regard, it's like the support from your family or friends. And in the humanistic point of view is essentially the warmth, love, and acceptance of those around us, including the family or friends. And frequently, Rogers' used term prizing may best capture this experience of receiving positive regard from others. As children, we bask in the glow of positive regard from our parents. Like plants with sunlight, we needed to grow. If we discover that our parents provide positive regard only when we behave in a certain ways, we will emphasize certain aspects or branches of ourselves and suppress others in order to attain it, the end result may be a version of ourselves that is markedly different from the version that might have blossomed if our parents had provided positive regard no matter what.
So that's humanistic psychotherapy. So let's review. We were able to discuss the goals, which is to foster self-actualization. That includes the need for positive regard, which has two elements, the conditional and unconditional positive regard. It was also discussed the meaning of ideal and the real self, including its importance. Congruence and incongruence was also given emphasis, including its concepts. The key elements of humanistic psychotherapy are genuineness, unconditional positive regard, empathy, and how well humanistic psychotherapy works. Well, that ends our discussion. I hope you guys enjoyed our video, and if you have any questions,
Just comment down there.
and please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye!